They held a variety of occupations. They were draymen, they were bricklayers, they were carpenters, and in fact, in Charleston, most of the building trades were dominated by free blacks.
But such cases were rare indeed. The vast majority of African Americans lived and died as slaves. Despite the harsh treatment, African American slaves and free blacks built a world of their own. Mixing African and American traditions, they poured out their joys and sorrows in music and dance, practiced their own brand of soulful Christianity, held on to their families as best they could, and carried on their private lives in the secrecy of the slave quarters. They resisted slavery in many ways, breaking tools, burning down barns and houses, running away to the north or to Indian tribes on the frontier. Some poisoned their masters. Some revolted. In 1811, slaves marched on New Orleans and were defeated in a pitched battle. Their decapitated heads were hung on poles as a warning to others. The greatest of all the uprisings took place in Southampton County, Virginia, and was led by a slave preacher named Nat Turner.
As I was praying one day at my plow, the Spirit spoke to me, saying, "Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you." I was greatly astonished, and for 2 years prayed continually. I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun darkened.
And he led a group of about 6 men heading from his owner's farm to an area called Jerusalem. On the way there, they killed 61 whites. The federal and state troops were called out against them, but they were able to elude them for about 6 weeks. Then they were captured, and he and 16 others were executed.
News of Turner's revolt spread terror throughout the South. Imagine what would happen if other slaves, now 1/3 of the Southern population, followed Turner's lead.
People lie down to sleep with fear. They hardly venture out on nights. A lady told me that for weeks after the tragedy, she had quivered at every blast of wind and every blow of the shutter.
White Southerners came to fear their slaves ever more, and so they clamped down. You see a whole series of post-Nat Turner laws that to make sure that the slave patrols actually went out on patrol to make sure that the slaves weren't assembling somewhere and gathering weapons and are going to rise up against their masters. Laws passed to prevent slaves from learning how to read and write so they couldn't communicate with one another and couldn't get these ideas. Because one of the other things white Southerners thought about was that, well, they couldn't have gotten ideas of freedom on their own account. They must have come from someplace else. Where? Why, they must have come from those abolitionists up in the North.
The Americans say that we are ungrateful. But I ask them, for heaven's sake, what should we be grateful to them for? For murdering our fathers and mothers? Or do they wish us to return thanks to them for chaining and handcuffing us, branding us, cramming fire down our throats? Or for keeping us in slavery and beating us nearly or quite to death to make us work in ignorance and miseries, to support them and their families?
The publication of former slave David Walker's Appeal in 1829 hit the South like a thunderbolt. Calling for violent rebellion by slaves, it was the most vigorous denunciation of slavery ever published in the U.S.
In fact, the slaveholders in the South called upon the governor of Massachusetts to arrest David Walker, and they issued a $10,000 reward ransom for his head.
No compromise with slavery. No union with slaveholders,
cried William Lloyd Garrison, who, after reading Walker's Appeal and seeing slavery in practice on a visit to Baltimore, started the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1831. Calling for an immediate end to the institution of slavery, his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, quickly became the most important abolitionist publication in the country. Garrison pulled no punches in his denunciation of slaveholders.
We would sooner trust the honor of the country in the hands of the inmates of our penitentiaries and prisons than in their hands. They are the meanest of thieves and the worst of robbers. We do not acknowledge them to be within the pale of Christianity or republicanism or humanity.
Such strong talk alarmed not just Southerners, but Northerners as well, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion. Most Americans thought of abolitionists as dangerous troublemakers. Angry crowds nearly lynched Garrison in Boston, burned down the new Abolitionist Hall in Philadelphia, and murdered Elijah P. Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois. Many others would also lose their lives in the fight against slavery. Despite violence and opposition, the abolitionist movement quickly grew in the North among ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Free blacks in the North also played a key role in the abolitionist movement. They organized themselves into local anti-slavery societies and worked hand in hand with whites for the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad, of course, was not underground, and it was not a railroad. It was a hidden method of slaves to escape from the South to freedom either in the North or all the way to Canada.
Escaped slaves also played major roles. Frederick Douglass, William Box Brown, and Sojourner Truth wrote autobiographies and gave lectures on the horrors of slavery.
Then, of course, you had Harriet Tubman, who became a conductor in the Underground Railroad, who returned to the South at least 15 times and freed some 300 African Americans from slavery.
American women also gave strength to the movement, organizing meetings, circulating petitions, hiding runaway slaves, and lecturing. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a prominent South Carolina slaveholder, were pioneers in the anti-slavery and women's movement. Collectively, the abolitionists painted a hideous picture of slaveholders as corrupt aristocrats and flagrant sinners, beating old men, misusing slave women, drinking, and dueling. The South banned the anti-slavery pamphlets and books, claiming they would induce slaves to slit their masters' throats. In the eyes of Southerners, abolitionists were fanatics, completely misrepresenting the Southern lifestyle. Tempers easily reached the breaking point.
Now, what would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? I will not stop to depict what everyone can imagine, but this is certain. England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king. Senator James H. Hammond, South Carolina, 1855.
Southerners defended slavery. They had to. They were so heavily invested in it that they had to provide what they thought was a reasonable argument. They loved to point their finger at Northern factory owners who had children and young women, as well as men, working in factories 10 or 12 hours a day in terrible conditions. Textile mills and breathing a lot of lint in the air and the fingers disappearing into machinery and so on. So the Southerners certainly argued that the North had its kind of industrial slavery and was living off the back of ill-fed, ill-clad workers, and they took better care of their slaves in the South than workers could find in the North.
Southerners didn't just defend slavery as an economic necessity. They also insisted that it created a world better than that in the North.
Slavery was built on a false idea. That idea was that all blacks were meant to be slaves. God ordained them to be slaves. They came up with what they called the mud seal theory, where in every civilization you must have people at the bottom who will do all the heavy labor so that those whom God has supposedly favored can be the civilized group.
With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here the two, not only different, but called by the same name, liberty. Abraham Lincoln, 1864.
Well, the issue of liberty in the country always had been a point of controversy. There were people in the North who felt that you could never have a fully free society dedicated to the principle of liberty as long as you had slavery, and that slavery would blemish American society, would blemish democracy. In the South, there were those who felt there was really no contradiction, that they, in fact, were doing a good thing by building up the country and also by bringing benefit, they thought, to black people. And that it was their liberty to do as they pleased. To be interfered with would be against their liberty. So you had these conflicting views of liberty.